Well, hi, and welcome to the Christian Contrast, where we talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live differently than those in the world around us. I'm Dan here with the solo episode, and I want to talk about a big topic today. I want to talk about God's wrath and God's judgment. And this is one of those topics that this isn't the first time on the Christian Contrast. We've talked about this. It won't be the last time. It's a constant issue that comes up. And even, in fact, in the little intro there where I talked about one of our themes on this podcast is that we talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live differently than those in the world around us. It seems like increasingly in the culture that we're in, talking about God being a God of love and that not excluding him being a God of wrath and judgment, that hell is real, that God really does judge sin, puts us in a position where we often do, as Christians, feel like we are in contrast to the culture around us. It feels like a minority position or a position that's largely antagonized. And then a lot of Christians want to figure out a way to ignore or fudge or apologize or do something about this because we're uncomfortable with it and because it's clear that the culture around us is uncomfortable with it. And we want people to love Jesus and we want people to become Christians and we want people to take God seriously. So a lot of times we're not quite sure what to do with this idea. So either we explain it away and say it's not really there, or we say, as I'm going to talk about, like, that's just kind of an Old Testament thing, or it wasn't really that bad, or maybe we just even say, yeah, that's in the Bible, but there are things in the Bible that we've moved on from and other things that we've kept. We're not quite sure what to do with this oftentimes. And as a church this summer, if you're a part of LBF Church, and during this summer, we've been walking through the book of Joshua, and you can't read through the book of Joshua without encountering this. You can't read through, we'll talk about this, many books of the Bible without encountering this idea of God being the judge, and of that judgment sometimes being frightening because of the judgment that God brings. So because this is a subject we've talked about before, we'll talk about again, I want to say in the 25, 30 minutes I'm going to talk about it here, this is such a long time Christian question that there's not this sort of half-hour discussion that's just going to solve everything. And at the same time, I think that there's a discussion that I can have here that will be helpful as we process this and will push us deeper into God and to his word and give us a different framework for how to approach this question without feeling like we need to deny it. So in this episode, I'm going to make 5 statements that I think are helpful to us in understanding God being a God who has wrath, who sends people to hell, who judges people. So 5 statements that are going to help us just process through that and work through that. So statement number 1 is this: God has not changed, and he hasn't changed tactics. I think that this is really important just out at the outset because it's tempting for a lot of Christians to say God in the Old Testament was a God of wrath, but then Jesus showed up and God is now a God of love. And I think it's messy how people talk about it. Sometimes it's almost like, well, God tried the wrath thing and it didn't really work out well. Or even worse than that is sort of like the Old Testament God was a God of wrath, but Jesus came and corrected all that by bringing love instead of wrath. I know a lot of believers that talk about this. In fact, I know some who have said, hey, I really like the Bible, but I just kind of feel like the whole Old Testament, maybe we just need to not talk about that. Maybe we just need to abandon that. Maybe we can take Jesus and not take the Old Testament. And what I always say, first of all, when somebody's talking to me about that, is I say, if you want Jesus, you're not going to be able to get rid of the Old Testament. Like Jesus was a huge fan of the Old Testament. He was constantly quoting it. He said, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. Jesus was not at all looking at the Old Testament and saying, what a mistake that was made back then, or that's a book we want to ignore and move on to something else. So if we want Jesus, we can't just ignore the Old Testament. And I think when we have this framework, the sort of Old Testament, wrath and judgment, New Testament, love and grace, what we need to do is we need to read more Old Testament and more New Testament. And we'll find that this is the same God. In fact, in the Old Testament, there's one passage where God reveals himself to Moses. And it's a statement that's quoted over and over again in the Old Testament and also shows up in the New Testament. It's in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, and I'll read them right now. It says, and he, God, passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Now here's the thing. When we're reading this, I'm reading that from the New International Version, but most English Bibles translate it similarly, where it's all of these things. Once again, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, and then, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. I understand why it's translated that way, but if you go back to the Hebrew, there is no strong adversative there. There's not, on the one hand this, but on the other hand this. They flow right together. God is a God of absolute grace and forgiveness, and God is a God who does not leave the guilty unpunished. So once again, if we're looking at the Old Testament, we're like, gosh, the Old Testament God, really kind of testy, just always hacked off, always angry at people, always burning cities. We get the ultimate definition, the self-definition of God, and it's full of grace and compassion and kindness and forgiveness. And at the same time, he's not leaving the guilty unpunished. God's grace is all throughout the Old Testament. This is a God full of grace and truth, which is a description given to Jesus by the Apostle John when he writes the Gospel of John. Jesus Christ, full of grace and truth. And it's not hard for us to look at Jesus and see the grace and see the love. We see it all over the place with the things that he does. But as some of you know, Jesus talked more about hell than any prophet of the Old Testament. He talked incredibly about hell in frightening terms about God's judgment. Jesus did not say, all this stuff about hell and judgment and God's wrath, that was a concept. We've moved on from that. I've come to bring love. Jesus, you can't deny in the story of Jesus that he is overflowing with love and grace. But that overflowing with love and grace does not at all nix out the idea that there is judgment. In fact, Jesus talks about the idea that he will be the final judge. And if you read the book of Revelation, you see judgment and wrath being poured out. So the reason that I wanted to start with this is because for a lot of Christians, there can be either just an absolute statement for this or a temptation to say in the New Testament, we see this. So even if in the Old Testament we see this and we can't figure out quite how to explain it, in the New Testament we see something very different. No, we don't. Read more of both. This is the same God. Now, something has changed. In fact, many things have changed in the coming of Jesus. And here's something that has changed that I think we don't always take into account in how this changes how we read different passages. In the Old Testament, for the most part, the people of God were identified with a nation with a land, a nation with borders, a nation with a king, a nation with an army. Nations go to war. Nations throw their citizens in prison if they have broken laws, and sometimes bring execution if they've broken laws. Nations go to war. Nations sometimes, like Israel, was used by God through warfare in order to punish the people that they were going against. Now, when we get to the New Testament, it's not that God has changed, but the reality of God's people, the dynamic of God's people is different than if we were an established nation with borders and with a king and with an army and with all of that. We are scattered amongst nations. God's people are scattered amongst the nations. We are pilgrims. We are exiles. We're the scattered people of God. We're participating joyfully and participating in redemptive gospel ways in the communities and in the countries that God has put us. But the church is not a nation in the way that Israel is a nation. And so the church is not throwing people in prison. The church is not going to war. The church is not overseeing capital punishment or something like that. Now, individual Christians may be involved in all that. Individual Christians may be involved in the military. They may be involved as police officers. They may be involved as judges, giving sentences. A lot of us are involved in juries that might be pronouncing judgment of some way. You might even end up in a position where, maybe you're a prison guard, maybe you're a member of the military, all that. Now, there is a line of Christians who believe that believers shouldn't be involved in any of those activities. I don't think that they're right. I think that those are redemptive activities. I think that there's enough in the New Testament to say that there is a good of nations looking to bring about justice. And I don't think that it's wrong for a Christian to be involved in the police force or in a government agency or to be a judge or to be a member of a jury or to be a member of the military. So as an individual Christian, if you're involved in that, you are sometimes involved in sort of the arm of judgment going out in some way, because you're involved in arresting somebody or throwing them in prison. Or with warfare, it's different, but there still is a dynamic of warfare where this is what nations do to defend themselves. And it's not wrong just outright for a nation to do this to defend themselves. So if you're looking at it and you're saying, yeah, but in the Old Testament, sometimes the Israelites were told to go out and like participate in this violence. And in the New Testament, we're not told to do that. I'd say, well, for the most part, you're right. But it's not because God's changed. It's because we are not a nation as God's people. But we sometimes do participate in those activities, and it's not wrong for us to do that. But it would be wrong for us as individuals or as a community church to say we are now sort of the vigilante arm of justice. That has changed, but God hasn't changed. God is the same. So first of all, God has not changed and his tactics have not changed. Second statement that helps us understand God's wrath and judgment is this: anger is sometimes the most appropriate response. I think sometimes we act as if we want a God who is unmoved and is never angry. But just in everyday life, and certainly when it comes to those in authority and those in power, we would think it's inappropriate for there not to be a time for anger. There was this trend going around. I don't know if it started on TikTok or YouTube, but whatever it started, and it was a prank. And what kids, and sometimes like by kids, it was like adult kids, but like older kids would do is they would video themselves in front of their parents, and their mom would say something, and then they would tell their mom to shut up. And they would do this to see the dad's reaction. And so it was a prank, the mom was in on it and everything, but they would do it to see the dad's reaction. And at least in every one of those videos I saw, there was a huge reaction from the dad. And sometimes even the kids who were doing the prank and the mom would be like, it's a joke, it's a joke, it's a joke. Like, it's just a prank. We were just doing this. There's the video. It's a prank, because his response was ferocious. There was about to be trouble that happens. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think most of us looking at that say, all right, it's not necessarily a time to do direct violence, but the angry response is something that many of us feel like that was appropriate. It is appropriate. If he just sort of sat there unmoved at the fact that his wife was just told to shut up by one of his kids, we would see that as not good. It's good that there's an angry response. Anger is not wrong. Anger is not something that's inherently sinful. Often it is sinful because of the way that we respond in our hearts and with our actions, but anger as a response to injustice or to suffering or to sin is not in and of itself wrong. It's an appropriate response. So for us, if we're looking at the suffering that goes on with human trafficking, or if we're looking at the suffering that goes on when there's domestic violence or divorce or any number of things, and we find that part of our response is to get angry at those who have caused so much damage, that's appropriate. Now, once again, it's not appropriate for us to go out and do vigilante justice, but our anger is appropriate. How much more for a perfectly just and good God? If he was looking at all the injustice of the world and he wasn't moved to anger at the suffering that was caused by this injustice, that would not be a good God. God's anger and wrath and judgment is not in contrast to his love. It flows out of his love. And so when we look at this, we have to recognize, all right, anger is sometimes the appropriate response. This isn't a flaw in God. In fact, this is something that we would think there's something defective if this wasn't a quality of God. So statement number 2 is sometimes anger is the appropriate response. Statement number 3 is we are often unaware of the patience that God shows before bringing wrath. If we look at stories in the Old Testament like Jericho or Sodom and Gomorrah or different judgments that we see, we often are terrified or we're troubled by the ferocity of the judgment, and that's understandable. What we often don't take note of is the incredible patience shown by God before bringing about this judgment. And I talked about this recently in the Joshua series, in the passage that we went through when the Israelites go in and conquer Jericho. And it's a brutal conquering that they do, because what was going on was not just Israel winning a battle, but God bringing about judgment on Jericho. And one of the things that I pointed out is not just with Jericho, but for this overall conquest that Israel was going on, part of what's going on is that God is bringing judgment to the Canaanites and to that entire region. But if you go all the way back to the book of Genesis and go back to a statement that God made to Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 16, he's talking to Abraham about the land he's promised him. And here's what he says: "In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." Now, here's what this means. He's saying, Abraham, right now you're standing in the land that eventually your descendants will inherit, the land of Israel, currently the land of Canaan, but eventually the land of Israel. That's where you're standing right now. But you're not going to get it right now. Your descendants are going to end up going down to Egypt, and then eventually they'll come back out of Egypt. He says generations from now, they're going to come back and inhabit this land. The reason you're not getting the land right now, Abraham, is because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. In other words, he's saying, Abraham, I'm being patient. I'm being patient with the Amorites. I'm being patient with the Canaanites. I'm being patient with the people. Eventually, time for judgment is going to come, but God shows incredible mercy and patience. And we see this theme brought up in the New Testament also in 2 Peter, when Peter's talking about how many believers are troubled over the fact that Jesus promised to come back, but he's not back yet. And even there's some non-Christians who are mocking them, like, why isn't he back yet? Here's what Peter writes in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. "The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." God is patient with people that he absolutely could judge right now. In fact, all of us who are believers in Jesus, we have experienced God's patience, and that's why we had time to repent. That's why we had opportunity to repent. So I think sometimes when we see the judgment passages, or even we read the book of Revelation and the ferocity of God's judgment, what we don't take into account is the incredible patience and mercy that God shows beforehand. He is not quick to anger. He is not quick to judge. He is quick to love, and he is quick to forgive. So much, he's so quick to forgive that even in the book of Jonah, that's what the story is all about. Jonah is annoyed with God because God is eager to forgive the Ninevites despite all the wickedness that they've done. God is a God who shows mercy and patience. So when we're thinking about God's wrath, we want to remember that we often don't give correct focus to his mercy and his patience before the wrath comes. Statement number 4 that helps us with this is that as human beings, our starting point is deserving wrath. I think part of our problem is that we look at the world and we say, okay, for me to be that angry at a human being, especially if it's somebody that I don't know very well, man, what would they have to do to make me that angry, to make me decide that they deserve wrath? And what we're not taking into account is that our starting point with God is it's not neutral and it's not good. It's not like, hey, I'm a good guy, I'm doing all these good things. What in the world could make God that angry that wrath needs to come to me? We are born in sin, and we are much more steeped in sin and wickedness than we even realize. Here's what Paul wrote in Ephesians, the first 3 verses of Ephesians chapter 2. He said, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." We are people. Our default setting because of what we've done is we deserve God's wrath. The surprising thing is that he gives us mercy. My father-in-law has written a lot about this and written a lot about sort of what is the perspective of heaven like. And one of the things that he talked about one time is that we as human beings, we ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And to some degree, we can all understand where the question is coming from, but there's a big assumption in that question, and that's that we are good people. And he talked about how probably the question from the angels to God, or the complaint from the angels to God, is, why do good things happen to bad people? Like, God, why are you continuing to give harvest rain to these people who behave this way? Why are you continuing to give health and blessing and marriage and joy and friendship and all of these gifts to people who are behaving this way? We think that the default setting is that we deserve all of God's goodness and all of his gifts. We don't. We deserve wrath. And it's not because there's some sort of random things that God just doesn't like, that they're not that bad, but he doesn't like them, and therefore if we do them, we get in trouble with God. God is wise, and every sin that we commit is not only a sin against God, it's a sin that impacts others in negative ways. We deserve wrath. And the sooner that we can conceptualize that, when we think of God's wrath, the thing that will amaze us is the mercy that he shows. And once again, I know I've mentioned the book of Joshua several times, but that's where we're at as a church this summer. It's so amazing that when Jericho is taken down, when Jericho is judged, Rahab, the prostitute, and her family are rescued. Even though they were residents of Jericho, and you can make the argument that they had guilt for the sins of Jericho, and they'd probably committed some of the sins of Jericho. I mean, Rahab was a prostitute, so she wasn't exactly the picture of purity in all of this. God showed incredible mercy. And God probably would have shown that same mercy to anybody in Jericho who would have come to him in repentance. God is a God who shows mercy because all of us deserve to be under his wrath. That's our default setting. The surprising thing is that he gives grace and forgiveness and mercy. And then finally, here's statement number 5. So let me just recap for us. Talk about, first of all, God has not changed and his tactics have not changed. Old Testament God is New Testament God. It's the same God. Statement number 2 is anger is sometimes the appropriate response. We would not, even in our own limited human wisdom, see a God who was never moved to anger or judgment as a good God, because he wouldn't be a good God. Statement number 3 is we are often unaware of God's patience before his wrath. He is a God who casts off judgment time and time again to give us an opportunity to repent. Statement number 4 is our starting point is that we deserve wrath. The surprising thing is that God gives us mercy. And finally, here's statement number 5 when we try to process God's wrath. God has shown himself to be trustworthy. Sometimes what we do is we look at an individual isolated passage in the Bible, and on its own, man, we wrestle with it. And I'm not trying to at all pretend that wrestling isn't real. Like, it is real. We feel the angst of these passages where there's judgment and where there's ferocious judgment, and we think about hell and we're terrified by that, and we're troubled by the idea of people going to hell. All of that is very real and understandable. But what we sometimes do is we look at those in isolation without looking at the big picture of what we know about God and about his character. And when we see that God is full of grace and truth, that God is more merciful than you are, more gracious than you are, more loving than you are, more patient than you are, and more just than you are, then it puts us in a position where at the very least we can give God the benefit of the doubt. We can say, okay, if I'm troubled by this, maybe there's something in me that's still defective, that's not really getting this. Or maybe it's that I lack information, where if I had that information, it would make me get this a lot more. And I would end up agreeing with everything that God has done. We get to give God the benefit of the doubt. And the biggest reason why we give God the benefit of the doubt is because of what he did through sending his son to the cross. One of the great passages in all the Bible, Romans chapter 3, and then especially Romans chapter 3, verse 26. Here, I'll read what it says and then make sure we understand it from context. It says, he, God, did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So here's what he's saying in this verse. He's saying, God sent his son to die in our place, so that he, God, could be just and the one who justifies sinners. God was at the one point totally just and righteous and leaving no sin unpunished. And at the same time, he was the God who was capable of showing mercy. because he didn't ignore sin. Sin was all punished in our substitute, Jesus. So when we look at this and we say, gosh, can I really trust God? Or is God really a good God if he does this? We get to look to the cross and say, all right, am I really going to doubt God's mercy and justice when he sent his own beloved son to die for us so that he could be both just and the justifier, that he could be full of both truth and grace, so that the wrath that flows out of his love could be perfectly fulfilled, so that he is that truly good God that we encounter both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And God has a pretty good track record. So what I'm not asking you to do with that is just say like, just get over it, or what's your problem, or just kind of ignore that. There still is a lot of wrestling and leaning in and reading and cultural understanding and cross-referencing and challenging ourselves. All of that still needs to happen. But my encouragement for you is to enter into that with what Augustine called faith-seeking understanding, which starting into it saying like, God, you get the benefit of the doubt. I'm starting from the standpoint of you have a good reason for everything that you do because you sent your beloved son to the cross. You are more merciful than I am, so I'm going to trust you in this. But God, I'm going to try to get better footing on this. I'm going to try to get a better understanding for this because this does trouble me. And I don't want passages in the Bible to trouble me. So God, I'm going to seek answers. I'm going to seek understanding. I'm going to seek growth. But I'm going to have faith-seeking understanding instead of saying, until every one of these individual passages squares with how I feel about things, I'm not going to trust God. We can trust him walking into that and then seek to know him and love him more through the fact that he is a God of judgment, he is a God of wrath, he is a God of justice. I said at the beginning of this episode, this is not the first time we've talked about it. It won't be the last time we talked about it. What I said with these 5 statements, that is certainly not all that could be said or needs to be said about this. But what I hope it is I hope it's a little bit of a framework and a starting point for you to be able to lean in and say, okay, this isn't something that I need to ignore. And this isn't something that needs to subvert my trust for God and my love for God. I can move forward in this. But I do want to say there might be some questions that you have. There might be something that you feel like, well, you didn't really address this, and you're probably right. You didn't really cover this, and you're probably right. Like I said, it's a big subject. But if there's something that you feel like is a good follow-up that you want to go a little bit deeper, please do leave a question on this YouTube video. You can find all the YouTube videos, all the videos for the Christian Contrast, either on our YouTube channel for Life Bible Fellowship Church or on our website for lbf.church. But we have episodes for years now. We put a new episode out every 2 weeks, so you can find lots of back episodes. But if you have a question specifically that's following up on this whole question of God's wrath and judgment, I'll be checking out the video later to come back and to interact with people that want to follow up on those sorts of things. So really invite that kind of engagement. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. We're going to be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Until then, thanks so much for listening to The Christian Contrast.